was what I read here. Maybe that was it. And I just extrapolated it into, well, because people, distillers grade, they're trying to get other things.
And maybe they don't have the contracts.
And they don't have the contracts, and they don't have,
I think it would be.
yeah. It's a domino effect kind of. With our leadership governance stuff, Christine, if you would just take photos of your notes and send those to me, I'll try to get them in the document.
I'll have to make them legible, but
I can read pretty bad handwriting.
Good to go.
I think we are. All right. I'd like to call this meeting to order this evening. It's, I believe, 6 p.m. And I will turn our agenda over to Superintendent Kramer.
Okay. Everybody hear me all right out there? Looking on Zoom. Okay. Seeing thumbs up. Good. Excellent. So the reason for this work session is to take a look at current policy and then also some work that the administrators have done to hopefully formulate some ideas to take to teachers to get an idea of where we want to go in the direction of grading and feedback. What I found over this last year is there seems to be, with our current system that we have in place, some confusion on a combination of a couple of things, being that we tried to kind of combine traditional percentage grading systems along with standards-based grading systems, along with our common assessment criteria, and all those things, and tried to develop and envelop them at the high school level. And what we kind of came up with is a system that's functional, but not necessarily a system that is great for student achievement and great for parent feedback and great for students. And so the idea was to kind of get together, get some ideas, and see where we could move from this work session. So you should have received in your email yesterday a draft of some ideas that the administrators, myself, and Donna have worked with and outlined that. So I thought what we'd do is we'd first start on that document. I'm going to see if I can pull that up and so I can reference it. And then hopefully you'll have an opportunity to have that on your own. But at any time, please, either administrators add anything, or if trustees have any questions, feel free to just jump in and we can kind of talk through some things. After we go through this, I was going to kind of reference to our district policy that's currently in place and how that would reflect any changes that we have. But as you can see on your screen right now is a draft of the teacher and learning practices that we kind of adapted to meet some of our needs. And some of the main things that we kind of, I hate reading through it, but the best way that I could kind of go through and discuss is probably read through that first area of teacher and learning practices, and then have any additional comments from the administrators or questions at that time. So I'll just kind of start from the top. And one of the big things that we wanted to focus on was students would be provided with proficiency scales for all standards assessed at the beginning of each unit. Now today I sent out some examples, an email, and those of you who are here have some of those examples, or one of the examples of a proficiency scale. And if you received the email, there are about 6 different examples of proficiency scales. This is the professional development that our teachers undertook earlier this school year, and then also during the time of school building closure were trained on. And so this would be a big component of the high school grading system. And so proficiency scales would be developed for all standards assessed and provided to students at the beginning of each unit. And a proficiency scale would be developed for each standard in the top 10, minimum 3 measures for each one. Students would be pre-tested, have common formative tests and semester tests, or in other circumstances where a semester test wouldn't be conducive, a culminating project. Each standard listed on the top 10 would have 3 to 5 common formative or common summative assessments during a school year. All students will be eligible to achieve a score of 4 based on the proficiency scales. That was something that I know was a point of discussion from previous pieces on achievement of a 4, when it was allowed, when a student could be able to achieve that on a retake, or when that would be open. And that was to address that concern. Feedback on student work would be given to students in a meaningful and timely manner. There will be more things to describe that, as this is just a draft. We want to get into more specifics. In grades 9 through 12, a student may earn a scale score of 0 when no evidence is presented. That was another piece of when it might be possible to not even achieve a 1 on a proficiency scale, and the description of that. Is that possible? And yes, in fact, it would be possible if there was no evidence present. Teachers would work with students to complete a reassessment agreement if appropriate. That is the last page of this draft, is the reassessment agreement, or last 2 pages, I guess it fits on 2 pages. We would, in fact, have a reassessment agreement that would be district-wide, would not be individual class like is currently in practice, where we just have differences throughout the district in regards to what a reassessment agreement. This would be something that would be across grades 9 through 12 and in all buildings. And then data collected on non-academic factors like being in class, being polite, positive attitude, productive participation, and persistent would be reported separately, which is also currently the practice in policy. It's stated that those same things, there would be no change there, but it's also more specific to some things as we discuss. High school principals, or Donna, if you have anything to add to that section to elaborate more on thoughts and discussion as we've conducted through that piece.
I don't have anything to add. I think you did a good job.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Teachers will work with students to complete a reassessment agreement if appropriate. What does that mean? How do we decide what? Yeah.
Let me let Mr. Plendel in here 1 second. Sorry, I'll
Sure.
stop sharing. I have to manage
No problem.
and admit Mr. Plendel in. And then we should be good. I'll go back to where I was at. So can you repeat that question? I'm sorry.
The question is on the line, teachers will work with students to complete a reassessment agreement if appropriate. What is if appropriate?
If they want to actually have a reassessment.
I mean, is there a time where reassessment is not an option? If, in case they scored too high the last time, or what is there?
No, to me, there would not be a time in which you actually, if the student desires for a reassessment, there would not be a time in which that would be denied. The only time that I think if appropriate was probably in there, and please administrators, if you want to jump in, I don't think that they're necessarily, if we want to elaborate on there, if they want to utilize a reassessment might be more accurate, because it's outside of that. I would not necessarily see an indication where we wouldn't use that reassessment agreement to have students reassessed.
What if they've done it 4 times?
No, that's
Which one?
And actually there, I think we do
Yeah,
hopefully
you do.
get to
Okay.
more specifics
Okay, so
in
that
regards to that.
I think Ryan, that given the reassessment agreement that's and that's at the end of this, but I think it would be fine to take the if appropriate out of there, because the reassessment agreement should apply for any time that there's a reassessment is going to take place. It's open enough that it should be applicable in all situations.
Yeah, and I think we do get more into specifics on what time period that reassessment could take place and how many, I think.
And the 10 days following the original assessment.
So that'll come.
And just a corollary remark that I noted while I was going through this as a former English teacher, when we're talking about giving feedback in a timely manner, if I have 80 kids and I have to assess a paper that takes 20 minutes each, that ends up being 26 hours of grading. And getting those back to kids in a timely manner becomes a real challenge.
And I think that too becomes in relation to what is formative and what is summative. And that's where I I mentioned too, more specifics needing to come from that. Because our vision is in a formative manner.
Yeah.
It should be very quick, but in the
Right.
summative piece, then that the necessity to have is there, but not necessarily as time constricted. As one of the forms.
KP, when we were discussing that, we did try to quantify that, but your argument is the reason we went with timely versus saying feedback within an X amount of time, because we realize that there's certain things, as a science teacher, I might have a lab that is extensive and in the same situation you're talking about. So we took the numbers off of that to make it more reasonable for everybody.
And pedagogically, when you're assessing compositions, it's more valid and more sound if you can sit down and do that in one session or 2 consecutive sessions, so that you're not bringing a different mindset to your assessment every time you sit down with pieces of writing. So it's a tough situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And especially when we're trying to improve writing, which we have been for, 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. That's an excellent question. And actually, I appreciate Mr. Gilchrist kind of jumping in there and with that reminder of why that discussion, why it was actually not quantified as opposed to,
Yeah.
because in others, it actually, in other examples that we were looking at, it was quantified.
Yeah.
That discussion,
Yeah.
talking about the difficulty and the significant difference between going through a 10-problem math quiz, which was very quick and easy, versus a composition paragraph that can take
Just 500
minutes.
words.
Yeah,
That will get you 15 to 20 minutes every time.
absolutely, absolutely. Any other questions, comments on the teacher learning practices portion? Okay. In the student learning portion, student work will not be used in calculation of the final score. This is kind of, and I'll get to more description on student work. Student work is designed to provide practice and application of new concepts and skills essential to developing proficiency on unit outcomes. Student work can include, but is not limited to written work, digital exercises, hands-on activities, direct instruction, and group work or homework. If a student is not proficient on student work, they will be assigned required flex time and or a form of remediation outside of school hours until the student is proficient on the homework that was assigned. Here's where this kind of the description of, we can go on what actually the description of student work is and how that fits in. We believe it is actually very important to have that practice, but actually that reflection on, and there's a lot of graphs and examples. Actually, Mr. Christensen sent me a great article with a graph that I might bring up, but it shows the students in regards to the ability where homework or certain work is inflated and where it's not necessarily reflective of their ability to complete standards, where I've learned to do the game of school, really, where I figured out that if I can turn in all my work, show up on attendance, I can get into that A-B range and I can still bomb assessments. And then that occurs. And it's not necessarily a reflection of what a student is knowing and able to do. Those things are very important skills, but not necessarily a reflection of what they're able to do in that content area. And that's where we feel that things like homework are important and actually should count something that is actually even more meaningful to me than when I talk to kids. Their free time, their flex time is extremely valuable to them. So when they don't do those things of student work, they're held accountable to having to make up that time, but it's not necessarily reflective in their overall grade or final grade in that criteria. And that's a little bit different because for me, I was great at playing the game. I could do the homework, do all the things that I needed to do, show up, jump through those hoops, and then not really have to study for the test because it really wasn't that important. And that was the key there on learning the game of school. And when we look at more traditional weighted factors, because right now we're not in that system because it can be, what we have right now is we're in a system where things can go from weighted so very differently on certain assessments and certain assignments that you can manipulate the system. When we move into a system that we're more specific on student work and where it fits in, we kind of don't eliminate it completely, but we help to kind of curtail what that true meaning would be and be more reflective of what the students are able to do. And a big component of that, another article that Mr. Christensen sent really illustrated what was very interesting to me is how socioeconomics ties into inflated grades. And we see, what is necessarily a reflection of when we look at our high schools and things, and we look at the number of students that are achieving at a certain GPA, but yet we look at standardized test scores and we have this significant variance. That's where we kind of find out, boy, our grading and feedback system is not necessarily reflective of what kids are able to know and do in regards to standards that we're assessing. That it's more weighted towards a lot of those soft skills that are important, but not necessarily giving kids good feedback. And I always reflect back on, we had a student that I can vividly remember. She graduated with the highest GPA in the class, and one of the nicest kids, always did really good homework, was able to utilize extra credit to the best of her ability, and that's where she got her GPA up. Her very first year of college, went in and was absolutely, she had been in pre-med and actually with the understanding that, oh boy, this is going to be easy, I'm going to walk through this. And it was not necessarily a reflection of what she was able to know. We did her such a disservice by inflating those grades because of those things that she went into. Great kid, will actually have some great things and great outcomes, but we did not provide her with the information that she needed to make a good decision on how hard she would have to work in college to attain the skills that she needed. So that kind of addresses that. Any other comments from administrators or questions from any other? Okay. Homework, this kind of goes also, I got ahead of myself a little bit too. Students are expected to complete homework as assigned to practice essential skills aligned to current instruction. When homework is assigned, completion of homework, it will be documented, recorded in the grade book, and provided as feedback to students promptly, but will not be used in the calculation of a final grade. Again, this goes back to, we believe homework is extremely important, but it is not necessarily, and what we're really, I can reflect right now on the last 2 weeks on how, when we look at homework, advantages or disadvantages of kids based on their home lives, and how that is so unequal when my kids have, right now, my wife's aunt is there, and she also has multiple master's degrees in the home, and 2 people, an adult there 24 hours a day to help with any of the needs. But then I know that we have other families living in trailers because one of the family members is in quarantine or has to work outside of there, and they're on their own for 20 out of the 24 hours with siblings, and how that inequity arrives. Our best place to assess and learn really what kids can do is through the classroom and really understanding that. And that homework is vitally important, but that homework also reflects a need for maybe extra assistance through that flex time. And so if they're choosing not to do that, we're providing that additional time to get that practice, not necessarily putting that into a final grade and illustrating the inequities and exacerbating the inequities that might be outside of the school.
I'm of the strong belief that homework should be limited, particularly in elementary school. You have our kids 8 hours a day at school, right? I mean, I feel like it should be minimalized anyway. And I don't know what our current homework policy is, but
We don't, maybe one of the, any of the other administrators can kind of speak to this a little bit more than my familiarity with that. I don't believe we have anything specific in any guidance or practice in regards to minutes for homework in any of our grade levels currently, but it might be something. I know a lot of other districts that have added that guidance specifically in the expectations. I don't think we have anything there since I'm not here. But yes, that would be something for further discussion because there's a lot of research done on that also.
there was a proposal in 2016
Oh, was there? Okay.
from Torrington High School leadership class that They worked with, and my son was on the team to do it, so that's why it
Right.
existed. And they met with Gene a few times, and they were supposed to eventually bring ideas to the policy committee or to the board, but that never did happen. And it was student-led, and
Mhm.
there was some good guidance there.
Yeah.
Things that maybe we didn't think about as adults.
Right, yeah, it's easy to not put ourselves, I mean, it's tough to, when we don't have that realization or that student at home, put ourselves into those shoes of how time constrictive things are, especially when we're talking about extracurricular activities and all of those things that students have to find time for.
Jobs,
Jobs, exactly, very much so.
childcare, civil
Yeah.
care, all that.
All right, and checking for understanding.
Yeah, I have a question, Mr. Kramer.
Go right ahead.
So, and I get what you're saying about not having homework counting towards the final grade, and even the homework and then these things that are also then included in the assessment. One of the things that I've appreciated this last year having a freshman is that, you know, when those homework assignments or those other in-class type things do count towards the grade, we're getting that feedback as parents, you know, through Power School or, you know, even through our kids if they're taking the initiative to, you know, be active in Power School. If we take that aspect out where the homework's now it's not going to be counted, how do parents then, or even the kids, you're going to see some lag time then in what, you know, how they're actually performing then?
And I think where we talk about student work above there, I think it's still, in my opinion, is entered into the grade book, but it is entered as a complete or not complete. So there is that opportunity for feedback. There's that, and it is, when I say not graded, it means that it's not graded in the overall final score, so it doesn't calculate in. But there is a way to, when we look at things, to provide that feedback in a way that you can still give where a student achieved that or a score, but it doesn't go into the final culmination of their final grade, if that makes sense.
Okay, so we would see progress, we would see results. It just wouldn't go towards that final number.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
That's actually imperative that parents and students get that feedback from that work, because that's where it really it makes a difference then on that either formative assessment or summative assessment, because they got that feedback. Because that's really what we're looking for. We know factually that makes the biggest difference is getting that feedback on a regular basis to adjust that learning and how much either harder they need to work or what additional skills they need to gain to be proficient in that area.
Add to that, if I can, our hope there too, Mr. Jesperson, is that the number of assessments may increase, given that they're going to be smaller form assessments, and putting those in the grade book will be an actual representation of what student learning is, rather than too often right now when we put in a homework score or a project score, it ends up being whether a student did it or not, which may or may not be an accurate reflection of learning. And I think that the system that this allows for will be communicating the learning progress to parents as well as students rather than participation.
Okay, so just to make sure I understood you, because it kind of, and I think it was on my end, but there's going to be more, maybe smaller, but still more frequent things that are actually assessed that go towards that final grade.
Yeah, that's our hope that, well, actually that actually is part of this, is that there are more frequent formative assessments that are part of the grade, but they're not necessarily taking place outside of the classroom.
And this is Carlos. I guess the thing is that going to be explained a little bit more clearly for parents? Because I kind of have the same question that Mark did, and without that explanation, it's just very unclear.
Yeah, what I envision this draft going is to teachers, and then also then back to the board for final approval within a format for policy. And then with that, I think that it's important that we have some opportunities for parents in open houses at all 3 high schools to explain this in more detail, to allow them to ask those specific questions, and even at this time, even possibly add to what we're seeing within that draft, so we can be more specific on the way that we're envisioning it as we're hearing your questions as parents too.
One of the biggest complaints that I heard from parents when we switched 5 years ago or started changing grading systems was that, the papers used to come home, we'd help the kid with it. We would understand what they could or couldn't do, particularly at the lower levels. And then the paper would go back to school, and then it would come back home, and we'd see the grade. Well, then that stopped happening. And then, as things progressed, then we would look on Power School. And then when we changed the grading system, all of a sudden there was nothing. There was no feedback at all. And so this homework being addressed is really important. And I think it says in this document, when homework is assigned, completion of homework, it will be documented, recorded in the grade book, and provides feedback. It can't be a complete or incomplete. It has to be something that an instructor looked at. I mean, there's a lot of, did you do it? And we self-grade it in the classroom. So then when you sit there and you fix it in the classroom, then you also don't have an accurate reflection of what the student could accomplish first time. So I think that although it might not be a big part of a final grade, it's really important to document, and probably some staff may think that that's unnecessary but it is necessary. It's necessary for communication, and it's necessary for feedback to parents.
And I think even better than the homework piece is like what Mr. Kirshenson was talking about, is that common formative assessment piece and that feedback, because that's going to be very, very valuable on what skills the student is expected and actually related to that summative. So that if I'm that student or parent, I can see specifically on that formative, here's where they're being successful, here's the areas they're not, here's where we need to work. Because you're absolutely right. Feedback is the most important. You can have any set of grades. If you're not providing good quality feedback, it doesn't matter in the system, because kids aren't going to have that idea of where they need to actually improve. And that's where it's really important to have that. And that's why it's mentioned multiple times in there in regards to feedback for students.
Is there a good understanding among teachers that they are free to assign additional work beyond what their colleagues are doing to meet the needs of a certain class or a certain group, especially those that are impacted, for example, by a snow day or by, instances where half the class is gone for an activity? And so
I think I'd let the principal speak to that, but actually what I would say we're going to, just by fault, the last 2 weeks, I think have really demonstrated absolutely your exact statement. And we're going to talk more in depth about it at our district-wide staff meeting tomorrow, is that exact point. But I'll let the principal speak to that specific question.
principals, do you have a feeling like your teachers feel as though they have that freedom and authority? Or do you think they feel constrained to stick to what their colleagues are doing?
I would answer that very plainly. Last fall, one of my language arts teachers was very forward about the fact that in addition to the instruction and assessment that her and her collegial team design, that's just a large percentage of what she does in the classroom. And she has the latitude and ability then to fill holes and gaps as she sees fit for the students within her room in addition to that. And that's what grows students academically.
Thank you, Mr. Epler.
I would also say, Mr. Epler, that they are allowed to extend learning beyond what they are doing collegially when kids are ready for that. They've always been given that latitude.
So in other words, the kind of the common understanding and formatives and assessments constitute a floor or a baseline, and teachers are free to reteach or re-emphasize and then enrich.
I would say it's probably a little bit more than a baseline. But I think it certainly sets I would say an intermediate level that we shoot for, and with flexibility on either side of that line to either remediate or enrich. And you guys talked about it. That conversation's been had a lot over the course of the last couple of weeks. And it's not a much different conversation than we have throughout every year. It's what needs to be taught, and then there is some autonomy on how it is taught.
Thank you.
I think, and ideally, the way that the district has been talking for a while and continues is that would become a floor. And I think the terminology we use in the profession is guaranteed and viable curriculum, call it a GVC. And if we're going to choose the standards and we're going to say we're going to guarantee that to every student, then it truly does become a floor. And then teachers are allowed to extend beyond that. I think that this system, if it's what we continue and go forth with more often assessments and those being common and teachers working together to plan for them, will help us move toward that ability to guarantee an education to students.
And I'd say the proficiency scale work that the teachers are doing is going to go a long ways to promoting some of that commonality and getting to the best practice for teachers.
Other thing I think that people may not understand is that the state requires every school district to have a guaranteed and viable curriculum that teachers are assessed on, that it didn't matter which school you attended or which teacher you had at a certain grade level, that every kid would be guaranteed that exact curriculum at a minimum and be able to move beyond that. But we're required and accredited based on that.
Thank you, Mrs. Fields.
Okay. Good conversation. Checking for understanding then, next area. Checking for understanding may include but is not limited to teacher observation, tasks, performance on exercises, quizzes, and conversations with the teacher. This also include checks for understanding will be recorded in the grade book. And I can see I did take it out of this as the draft, but we did have an area that we eliminated in the grade book, but will not be used to determine proficiency for an outcome. Questions or comments related to that?
Yeah, this is Carlos. I guess, so is this checking for understanding, is this a separate step from the provided feedback to students for their homework?
This would be something that might be separate, that the teacher may have in a traditional system assigned a percentage to and placed it in the grade book to go towards the final grade. And we believe that it's important. Teacher observations are important in there, but might not necessarily be 100% reflective of what the student should know on that standard, and can sometimes, in some cases, be inflated due to behaviors or work ethic or those type of things, which are very important skills, but not necessarily reflective of their ability to perform mathematics or their ability to write a strong paper. And that's where that feedback is important in those areas, but not necessarily used to determine proficiency.
Thank you.
Common assessments, and as in parentheses, 3 to 5 per standard. So all commons given as a pretest and final. These can be formative or summative, commonly developed and scored with a proficiency scale. Common assessments will be administered to assess student learning of the prescribed curriculum. Criteria on a proficiency scale for each outcome will determine the level of an individual student. Students will have 10 school days following the notification of performance on the common assessments to retake the assessment to improve their score. In order to be eligible for a retake, the student must complete a reassessment agreement and complete the preparation task before a retake is scheduled. The student may retake any outcome test they receive a 1, 2, or 3 on to improve their score. We mentioned this because there have been some differences in opinions in regards to what scores constitute an ability to retake. We want to make sure that, the only one that you probably and certainly could, but if you get a 3, you still have the option to get a 4. If the student demonstrates that past scores no longer accurately reflect their learning, that score will be dropped and replaced with a new score.
Should this not say the student may retake any outcome? Should it not say 0? Because we talked about the fact that a 0 is an option.
Yep.
If they do 0 work, they should get a 0.
And they can retake
I'm
it.
seeing nods from the administrators, so yeah, that would make sense. We just added that to my draft, so go there.
Christine, I think we missed that because we view a 0 as not being a retake. It's going to be a first take after it was supposed to have been.
Sure.
But that's, yeah.
But if there is no take, you would have received a 0.
Right.
Correct.
So you want to, yeah, and I think it's important to be very specific on that. So yeah, no, that's a good catch.
I don't see here, or is 0 through 4 whole numbers? Are those the only options, or are we using 0.5s?
No, those would be the only options. No, am I incorrect on that, Mr. Christensen? Where did we set that up?
If you look at our proficiency scales, all of the proficiency scales, teachers have the option to put those 0.5 indicators in. And those 0.5 indicators will be similar across all proficiency scales in the district, so that the language between a 2 and a 3 will create a 2.5, and it'll say a student was able to achieve some of the 3.0 content with help, or the language between a 3 and a 4 will be similar, so that those 0.5s will be available.
I'm glad you thought of that question like that. I was actually thinking of it based on a percentage, so I'm glad you understood the question, because that was more accurate than, because I was visualizing it on a percentage. But yes, it would either be a 0.5 or a whole number.
I think if the 0.5 exists, it solves a lot of issues that questions that students and parents and some staff members have had over the past years. It just has to be defined. What's the 0.5 level? But if it's available, I think it helps solve a lot of the problems that we were being faced with.
And I think if you look at the proficiency scales that Mr. Kramer provided you today, you'll see the 0.5s in there. And you will see the definition that we put with that, which was basically they have some of the characteristics of, let's say they have a 2, right? 2.5 right now. They have some of all the characteristics of 2 and some of the 3 possibly.
And that's why these proficiency scales, and again, the feedback is so very important to the student. Even before they go into that, knows exactly what will meet that score, not necessarily have it in not clear language to them and the parents. You know, what does a percentage truly mean? This elaborates specifically. Here's exactly what it means and what's important on this subject area.
Ideally, and the work with proficiency scales that teachers have been doing throughout this year, ideally, a proficiency scale can be used by a student and a teacher the same way to look at the work that's been done and just indicate based on what standards have been hit, what the score is going to end up being. And we've been working hard in all schools towards student self-assessment. And in an ideal world, the student self-assessment where a student's going to come in and mark themselves matches with where a teacher would mark them. And that's just a conversation that happens quickly. And that's the score that ends up being given.
Okay. Other questions on common assessments?
Do teachers have, again, the freedom and autonomy to extend instruction beyond perhaps a commonly agreed upon date or point in the quarter at which to administer an assessment?
That's a great question. Currently, we have it very, very specific. That would have to be something that we discuss or look at. We didn't touch upon that in this conversation.
Okay.
As we talked.
Because again, you know, we've had teachers whose classes were impacted by snow days or activities or whatever, and they find that one class is lagging behind and needs extra time to get to the point where a common assessment could be given successfully. And when they had to stick to, a commonly agreed upon time frame, sometimes that was not what was best for student assessment.
But what has happened with the collegial teams, and we actually see this a lot, is we'll have a teacher that says, man, I'm behind because of whatever happened. And they will all agree to move their dates to meet, and they really work with each other on that. Is how that's been handled so far.
Okay.
So I'm wondering why do we not give a teacher a curriculum and say, this is what you have to accomplish either quarterly or in a semester? Why do we worry about each school at the same place at the same time? Why don't we just give them the curriculum and say, accomplish this by the end of the semester? What's the thinking there?
So the thinking with common assessments and professional learning communities is that assessment is not just about student learning. That is the second reason you'd give it, really. The first reason that you're looking at that assessment is for teachers to be able to look and say, oh my gosh, Chase, you got such good scores. How did you do that? So that you're looking at the same time frame, the same assessment given to the same groups of kids, because they're not too different in the buildings, and saying, hey, what techniques did you use that really gained the best progress with kids? So you're really trying to peer poach from each other the best strategies that work to get the highest scores. The second reason on there is really about the student learning, because going into that test, probably most of those teachers know about where those kids will score and what they will really where they'll land on each of these components, because great teachers know that. But it's really about trying to find the techniques that really work, that get the highest achievement.
I would think that we should look at that. I know that and maybe some of the other board members can attest to this as well, that from staff, and some of the major complaints that we've had is that, well, Lingle wasn't doing that. We had to sit and wait, or we had to speed it up. I think probably we should relax that. We can still compare, even if it's for the next semester, or maybe not make it quite so stringent, so that buildings can go at the pace that they need to, with still some guidelines so that teachers can compare notes. But I do know that in reading the surveys we've done and taking feedback, that is a point where that students and staff have complained about being put into that box of time frame.
And the point has been made that, for example, best practices for Chase may not be best practices for me. And best practices for me on Monday with my first period class may not be as effective on Wednesday with the same group of kids. But there are so many variables that we're working with as far as instruction and learning from instruction, that while it's fine to trade ideas about what's effective for one person may not be effective for another person. And what's effective in one group of learners may not be effective for another group of learners. And so allowing teachers that autonomy and relying on their judgment is sort of a salute to their own professionalism and to their own utilization of their skills and observation in their chosen profession. So this has been, just a real dicey situation for a lot of our instructors.
It has been, and it's one of the hardest things to get over, but I know that when you look at the trainings that we've provided for teachers with the professional learning community work, they will all tell you, every one of the, like Mike Matos that has been here, and the gentleman, we could name them all, Ken Williams, they all will tell you that a common assessment is common, and that it's done, anything that's changed in there is not a common assessment. And so given at the same time, within the same time frame and such, is what makes that the common assessment. And that they would suggest that you don't change it. And that's why we have been very relaxed in letting teams work with each other, and they're good. Like English 4 is a great example. I think it was English 4. one of the teachers was really struggling and was running 2 weeks behind, and they were like, let's just move it. It's not a big deal. And they moved it because their kids weren't ready.
Wait though? Did they have, I mean, were they not allowed to move on to the next thing? Because that's what we've been told, is that when we stop and we wait for a class to catch up, that those other classes are kind of in limbo.
I don't think, I think they go on. I would need to check with them on that one to make sure, but I think they go on and then they just all come back and reassess when it's time. I know Jen and I have had that conversation before from Southeast, but
And
I
are
would
them,
need to check with that team.
if they move down, are they then assessing something that they taught 2 weeks ago? I mean, that's what I've been understanding is part of the problem.
That may happen, yes.
One of the things that I think is a challenge is, and it requires oversight from administration, is really those things of when and why are we falling behind? Because really, if we had a Goshen County High School, which is the envision of all of our kids achieving, no matter what school they attain or went to, they're achieving at that same level, or we have that diploma. The concern that I have is if we're getting significantly off more than a couple of days, obviously there's some more issues beyond just kids missing class. I mean, there is significant deficiencies or something in there that isn't necessarily reflective. So I mean, to me, if we're beyond a couple of days, there's something else that's occurring, and that requires administrative attention beyond what's already occurring. The things that worry me when we start playing with those dates and that ability to move, we get even further and further. And so Southeast completes, I always put it back to the math book, because I don't think I was probably in my first 7 years of math ever taught statistics, because it was the last chapter of the book. No one ever got to it. We never got to the last chapter. And that's what would be concerning to me, is if we don't hold to those and then say very specifically, and there are ways to address that, either through observation and more documentation for the teacher to say, you completed this and we expect this and this has to be done, versus some other things. I think it deserves further conversation administratively on looking at it, but I don't necessarily think that an open semester would be maybe the best practice, because I think that does curtail a little bit too much of what could happen in some buildings, because, we just didn't get it. And I worry about, not necessarily in this conversation with here, but when we look at our elementary schools and the vast differences that we know, unless we're willing to start going, you do an excellent job here, we're going to move you into this building, we're going to punch you in here because we know you can get the best things from those students, that this becomes a little bit more challenging. Working in that collaborative effort in those collegial groups is really important in tying to those dates. But I think there's a good balance that we can kind of come up with in that further discussion. And that is something we're discussing, is the collegial groups. What is the best practice? What is the best things to utilize those groups for? And what makes their time the most valuable setting those? And what makes the most difference for student achievement in keeping it consistent across the district, not necessarily having these peaks in one school versus valleys in another.
There's one instance that comes to mind for me that my oldest son graduated in 2015, so it would have been 13, 14, probably 14, 15, I don't know, somewhere in there, with college biology. There was always comment of waiting for other schools to catch up. I don't know what that was or why it was, because we really weren't even in this system that much of the time. But I think we definitely need to, particularly between schools, because differences in communities, even though we want the whole district to be operating as one, we need to definitely think about differences in schools and timelines maybe.
And our college courses do not have common assessments district-wide. Never have had them. Just so you guys know that. And we do have a few teams in the district that, like one example is PE, or two examples, PE and art. They cannot give it, they only give semester assessments that are similar. So like lingual might give it in October, where Southeast is giving it in December, just based on usage of facilities or usage of equipment and stuff. And those teams are not as high functioning as some of the others because they don't have that same common conversations at the same time. So I definitely agree that it needs more conversation on the admin side and stuff. I just wanted to give you some examples of those.
Thank you, Mrs. Fields.
Okay. Then looking at, if there was any other comments or questions centered around common assessments. Final grades. At the high school level, common assessment scores will be averaged to produce a single subject letter grade. This is kind of where parents and such are a little bit more familiar, and students going into.
Ryan,
Yep.
you go back to sharing the grading policy rather than proficiency scale.
Appreciate it.
You're going to get proficient at this yet.
I am. I'm going to be really good at this by the end. Okay. So at the high school level, be awarded A, B, C, D, or F. Students will not earn credit for a grade of a D or an F. And this kind of goes into where we're talking about our proficiency scales and the relatability there, where you see these averages. During the last 5 days of the semester, students will be given the semester final exam, compile the common assessments from the semester. This will provide an opportunity to improve students' grade on a standard. If the other common assessments indicate learning on the standard, the semester test will not lower a student's score. So we believe that it is important to have that practice and opportunity to demonstrate learning, but it is not something that we want to put in a high stakes testing format, because we know some students really struggle with that. And it's not necessarily a reflection of true learning if we put it all into one high stakes test, but it is an opportunity for them to practice and demonstrate. If it's taken them the whole semester to show that learning, they still have the opportunity to improve all those scores. And then right under that demonstrates the average across multiple standards. So what we'd be using is the traditional grade, would be more accurate than grading. But that would be the traditional grade, and that is the conversion from their scores within the grade book to those.
So is it only the common assessment that make up the student grade?
Common formative and common summative, yes.
So this says common assessment scores.
Yep. So assessments would include formative and summative.
Okay.
One of the things that may be very interesting about that, is very positive, is I know what the board has had questions before about, is the grade the same at Southeast as it is at Lingle and stuff? So by creating the grade being from formative and assessments as well as common assessments, that that would be more, they would be more equal.
So is there a scale of schedule, something that says the formative assessments versus the common assessments that are a certain percentage of the grade, or you just take it all, you take them all and average them, and that's the answer to the?
You have what it does is that it takes, if you look up the common assessments, 3 to 5 per standard. And so you could, and that all assets are common, they'd have to be the same in each individual area, but they could be 3 to 5. In that, and that's what is then averaged into that. Now, I say average, I shouldn't say average, because average gives the indication of a mathematical. There is no, if at the last time I give a formative or my summative, that student achieves a 4, but in every previous one, they had a 1. We don't average that because we're looking for the ultimate learning piece. They achieved a 4 when we were assessing at the most recent. They've achieved that learning. It should be expected that we're giving them the opportunity to learn that progress. And students do have the opportunity at their very start. If they're getting a 4, they should in fact then be given a 4 throughout and achieving. But that doesn't necessarily reflect that learning, because we have to have that correlation between teaching and learning, and actually at the end is where it's important that they attain. and not necessarily an average or mathematical formula to determine.
So if we say 3 to 5, that's 3 to 5 per student, not per classroom.
Correct, that's per standard, and there are 10 standards then per course. For top 10 is what we're saying.
And any given assessment could be measuring more than one standard. So you could, it doesn't necessarily mean because there's 10 standards and 3 to 5 per standard that there's going to be 30 tests in a semester. Just that there's going to be at least 3 measures on each standard. Could be an assessment might have multiple or even up to 4 or 5 standards on it.
So you talk about how we're going to, well, the example you used is if they got all 1s, but then on the last one they got a 4. So they've obviously shown some improvement, some growth, so they should be awarded that 4. Is that kind of what you were just saying?
Yeah, they showed that actually they understood really what more or less it equates to is that final summative piece of did you learn the content when we were done teaching it. I didn't expect you on my first assessment to achieve a 4 because if you did it at the very first, that's great. You did outstanding, but you obviously had learning that came in that wasn't necessarily reflected in your expertise or your previous course that you took, and might be a deficit. But if by the end of when we're finally assessing that, you're achieving at the highest level possible, it certainly is reflective of your learning rather than your prior knowledge coming into the course. Because if we did it on average, we would be awarding prior knowledge at a much higher rate than we would be the ability to learn the content when we look at the summative piece of it.
Okay, so
And the H. Warrington Middle School does it right now.
Go ahead, Mr. Jesperson.
okay, so my question is then, heaven forbid though, what happens if we go the other way? Right.
Right.
You would hope that wouldn't happen. You would hope that someone that scores a 3 or 4 the first time around shows that consistently through the exercise from start to finish, no matter how many times you test on that standard. But what happens if they regress?
I think that, Mr. Jesperson, that got up above where we talk about the final assessment, and it talks about there that the final assessment is an opportunity to improve those scores. But if they happen to score better earlier in the semester, that the final will not reduce their score in that instance.
And that same thing would hold true too to, in my opinion, the summative, where there's a reflection on this student obviously had this, they attained a 3 or 4 throughout. And for some reason on my most recent, whether they had a bad day or they had a fight with their boyfriend or girlfriend on that date, that's not necessarily reflective of their learning. And it should be used as a teacher's expertise that in having that conversation and that ability also, we should eliminate that with an ability to retake, because that student is also having the ability to retake that low score. And then we also have to look at really what is their knowledge level and look at the teacher's expertise regarding that individual student and what they can attain and what they should be awarded.
Okay, thank you.
I think as we talk through this last section, maybe to provide greater clarity for all of us and students and parents as well, it should be broken into those components that relate to the final exam or the semester exams. And then the last section would be the determination of a final course grade. Because those are 2 separate things.
I agree, Mr. Epler.
I would like to point out, just for clarity as well, in terms of what ends up on a student's report card will be that indication of the A, B, C, D, F, not the number on the left-hand side.
So does this mean that instead of what had been happening sometimes where grades had been being converted multiple times, everything is on the 0 through 4 scale, and in the end, the average is converted to the letter grade? Is that what we're talking about? Because the multiple conversions could really change a grade.
We've had,
It was,
administratively, we've had a lot of conversation about the number of conversions, and yes, that would eliminate all of that.
that's what I was reading, and that's what I hoped. That was right.
Yes, but it's good for to ask for clarification,
Yes,
just
yes.
in case, absolutely.
So the final grade is the letter, but as we, students and parents progress through the semester, we'll still see that number that's on the left-hand side though, right?
Correct. The only time you'll be seeing that traditional is on the student's report card or their in their transcripts. So yes, absolutely. But you'll still be looking at the threes, the 4 to 0 scale, because that's what will be reflective on those proficiency scales. Because those proficiency scales that the student will know about, and the parent, in my vision for it, and have a clear understanding of what is expected in that standard or that instruction, will be based on a 4 to 1 scale.
But this traditional grading, will allow us to use the traditional grading, convert it. I mean, that will get converted back for a grade point average.
Exactly. GPA is the same.
So a GPA, class rank, GPAs to send on to schools, those things are still usable with this.
Exactly. There's not
GPA as it exists right now will not be. The GPA will be similar to what you see on that left-hand column between a 0 and a 4. What our students and parents are used to right now is that 0 to 100% GPA. And since there isn't percents in this system, assigning a 0 to 100 GPA would not exist.
Thank you for that clarification. I forget that that's the system we've had, because I was not familiar with any other district that utilizes a 0 to 100. So that is something unique. But yes, we would be at a 0 to 4 GPA, not the 0 to 100 GPA.
But what I'm referring to is GPA used for colleges, which is converted to a 0 to 4.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, that's what and that would.
So the A would be a 4.
The A would be the
4. B would
B
be
would be
a
a
3.
3. And so though that conversion for a GPA doesn't necessarily match our average, because that's two different things we're talking about.
Correct.
But we still have a usable GPA.
Yes.
On a 0 to 4 scale.
Yes.
Understood.
Yes.
I think I understood where you're coming from on that one.
Yeah, clear as
So
mud, sorry.
No, I'm used to that other system. So yes, I know what you're meaning there.
But having that gives our students the option to, I talked about multiple times that if we take away a grade point average from high school, then we are only left with ACT scores to be the factor that get you into school. And if you're a bad test taker, then you're being hurt there. You can get in if you have this GPA and this ACT score. So now we still have a usable GPA for our Goshen County students going forward. And using that system gets us over a really big hurdle that I've had the last few years.
And Mr. Christensen earlier this year spoke to me about a student not quite understanding that entire system because of that. When they went to, I think it was an application process, Mr. Christensen, if I remember correctly, and you were referencing GPA, and the student not truly understanding that because of the system that we were operating in. Is that accurate, or?
Yeah, earlier in the year. I mean, our students truly understand GPA as being a number between 0 and 100, and when they're asked to fill out scholarship applications and such, and all colleges we know are looking for a number between 0 and 4, and we do end up seeing applications that have a number of something like 93 point something, and if a college gets an application where a 93.2 is written where GPA is, they're going to be asking some questions.
Doesn't our transcript show both a 98.3 or a 3.9? I mean, as I recall, I haven't looked one.
Right now, our transcripts have 3 different GPAs reported on them. It's got that percent GPA that's between 0 and 100. It's got a 0 to 4 GPA. And it's also got a Hathaway weighted GPA that ends up being somewhere between 0 and 5. So they've got all 3 reported on there. The state requires the Hathaway GPA to be reported. So we will probably be still reporting 2 GPAs on a student's report card or a student's transcript. It'll be the GPA that's converted or calculated using this ABCD, kind of the absolute traditional college GPA, and then the Hathaway weighted GPA as well.
We should teach our freshmen how to read that transcript. I'm not kidding.
They should teach our district employees and our principals how to read that transcript.
Mrs. Bullington, do you have any questions, remarks, observations?
Not at this point. I mean, my question was, then we will take off the 0 to 100 GPA off of our records, and he answered that.
Okay. And Mr. Clayton, how about you?
I don't have any questions about it at this time.
All right, everybody's understanding and compliant and
Or suggestion, I mean,
yes.
what have we not discussed?
Well, and I think too, just making sure, I don't want to go through the next 2 pages, but I just want to just point out, this is just a draft. There will be some changes to this as we've glossed over it. But this is what we want to make sure we have a consistent form district-wide that is clearly understandable for all students and staff to know what must be done, not individually per class. Well, I got to redo it for so-and-so, but so-and-so didn't allow me to get a 4 on theirs. And that also goes to that. And then looking at policy also, just to kind of reference that, this would not be, what we just shared would not be policy. We would still maintain some of the pieces in policy. Then when I go share the actual district policy here.
While you're doing that, I did think of one question, because I think either you or Donna said it at the beginning, is that staff would have input into this draft as well, right?
That is
Okay.
correct. Yeah,
Thank
what we wanted to do was just discuss it with, I know since it's been a very interesting topic in the past, rather than have large teacher meetings to include, that we wanted to start with board and where they were comfortable at, and then utilize that teacher input and then bring it back from there. But they would have the opportunity to share their thoughts and opportunity too to ask questions.
Thank you.
This is Carlos.
Go ahead.
Do you think that we can actually go through all this again? I'm kidding. I just wanted to see if people were in a good mood or not. So it was a joke.
And you're at a disadvantage for me too, because you can't see my face, from the longer screen. At least the others I can pick up on their facial expressions.
I wish we had a screenshot of everyone's face when he said that.
That silence, the silence was enough. Thanks.
Carlos, if it means that we can move forward with this after tonight, I will go through it with you 10 times.
Sounds good.
All right, so on your screen now, I brought up the policy, the actual district policy. And so the only things that I do see, number one, maintaining the same, and administrators too, jump in if you see any other things. But on number 2, the piece that I still think that Power Grade or Power School for grading purposes will still fit there, but will not be entered as percentages, will be removed. And then on number 3, this also would be 9 through 12 as opposed to 6 through 12. We wouldn't necessarily have rubric scores, but we would have scores that would be converted to letter grades when entered into the Power School or Power Grade. I think Power Grade is probably our old program, I think. And then, of course, the new chart would appear there for conversion to A, B, C, and D that's included in that draft. 4 would remain the same. 5 would be removed from and classroom assessments. I think we probably need to take a look at some language there to include commons as opposed to district assessment and classroom assessments, just for clarity purposes. Number 6 would be removed entirely, as we're not talking about weighted grades within categories. and weights assigned because they would be directly related to common formative or common assessments. And then progress towards the standards, we still would be utilizing the scores of 4, 3, 2, 1, but it wouldn't necessarily be a rubric. We might reference a proficiency scale there if need be. And then of course, GPA, I don't necessarily know that there'll be a change there, but I know that because it was the 0 to 100 scale was probably the reason that we went so far out of the decimals. And then of course we would maintain number 9 as it is stated in policy in regards to the effort, behavior, and attendance is not included in student grades. Even though we do know that that is an important factor, it's not necessarily reflective of the learning that is in the standards.
And I challenged the administrative team to develop a system for reporting those soft skills so that parents can see, you know, how their students might succeed.
And it could be incorporated too into that flex piece of, you know, how many times are they having to utilize or being assigned to flex in regards to work completion, because that is a direct reflection. It wouldn't even have to be extenuated, but there are important factors too that we have for those who attend parent-teacher conferences, that we want to have that same experience, to have that feedback in addition to those soft skills that we all know are very, very important in the workforce, that actually get people even sometimes further along than even the standard schools. Any other additional questions in regards to policy?
I think it's important too, and Mr. Kramer's probably already indicated this, but there are additional policies beyond this grading policy that are going to be impacted fairly heavily by a movement to this system, to include selection of valedictorian and salutatorian and things such as that. But it'll be have to comb through fairly carefully and make sure that all of our policies are aligning.
Participation trophies. Yeah, not anymore.
So that we didn't discuss it in the draft of grading that we started with. I'm assuming extra credits not, I mean, there's correct, because it says what goes in the grade and it does not include extra credit. That does not have to be stated separately, does it?
You know, I don't know. I'd actually ask the principals in regards to that. Maybe that is something that we add. They know their experiences with that better than I. But I definitely, if you feel it needs to be very explicit in that, I have a true belief in that statement, but I don't know if we feel it needs to be explicitly stated in that draft.
Maybe it needs to be explicitly stated
just for
staff.
Well, and for students
Yeah,
as well, so they know that they don't have extra chances.
Yeah, it used to be a thing in something.
Exactly. Credit is credit.
I think the fact that the entire grade is going to be determined by score on a proficiency scale, it doesn't really leave room for extra credit anywhere.
Yeah.
Remember, you have to present that information at least 5 times for it to be taken in.
Yeah, exactly. Where we need to do that. Any other additional questions, comments?
Would this be something that would start the next school year?
Yes. It would,
Start next school year?
yeah, our desire would be yes, to absolutely start this. And
Okay.
This was the first step, and then the very next step that will happen in short time is regarding to organizing staff to receive feedback on the same manner and ask questions and look for clarification. The only other thing that I'd like to discuss, I did share on that initial email, optional graduation dates to start sharing publicly. And I just wanted your feedback real quick. If those dates, you know, not being aware of a lot of different events that take place in the county and things and wanting to stay away from those, but also wanting to get some dates and ideas. Were there any conflicts that you were aware of that would be something we need to look at for a change there?
I didn't see anything.
Did we look at county fair dates?
Yes, that was county fair is on the August one. We went with, I would prefer actually a little bit later in August to give us some room, but because of county fair, it would have to be that August 1st date to avoid fair. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Go ahead, Mr. Christensen.
That June 13 day is right on the back end of the WASSP conference that I think Mr. Epler and I were planning to attend. I'm not sure on Mr. Gilchrist.
And where's that at?
It's in Saratoga.
I was planning on being in Ireland that weekend, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen anyway. So
Yeah, and that's a hopeful one. I'm still hopeful for May 24. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate the feedback, and I know it's a big commitment for many of you and things that you have in addition to this. So thank you very much. Stay healthy and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, administrators and board members, for joining us.
Thank you all.
Thanks. See you all.